Hello, Hamza. Okay, I hope everything is good. All right, so let's begin our today's lecture. Okay, last week we talked about the final days of the Ottoman Empire and we referred to the reform process in these final days. We talked about the aims of these reforms to transform the empire, and we talked about the main actors in these reforms. Okay, in this lecture, we are going to focus on another time period, which is the fall of the Ottoman Empire and the emergence of a new Turkish nationalism. Okay, so this week we are going to focus on the time period from 1918 until 1920, and we will talk about the major events in this time period, which resulted in the fall of the Ottoman Empire and the rise of modern Turkey. We will begin with Mudros Armistice, and we will move on to the defeat of the Ottoman Empire in the World War the First, and then we will discuss the role of the Sultan's government in Istanbul versus the nationalist one in Anatolia, and we will finish with the Treaty of Sevres. Okay, so let's begin today's discussion. So we already mentioned that the Ottoman Empire's participation in the World War the First on the side of the Central Powers led to significant losses in terms of territory. Okay, so this was a major failure for the empire, and it resulted in the loss of territory, resources, and human lives for the empire. So, as a result of the First World War, Ottoman Empire was weakened and it faced internal unrest. So, on 13th of October 1980, Ottoman Empire signed the Armistice of Mudros with the Allied powers. This armistice ended the empire's involvement in the war. However, it imposed several restrictions on the empire. These were the demobilization of the armed forces, occupation of the strategic locations, and control over the transportation and communication systems. Therefore, the Mudros Hermestais had quite difficult clauses for the Ottoman Empire to function, to continue to function properly. Okay, so we should also talk about the defeat of the Ottoman Empire following the First World War, and we need to understand the major consequences of this defeat. Firstly, this defeat resulted in the territorial losses. So the Ottoman Empire was forced to remove its control over its Arab provinces, and these Arab provinces were divided between Britain and France. Uh, Also, Greece, Italy, and other Allied powers were granted the right to occupy various territories in Anatolia, and this was another challenge for the empire. These were the territorial losses, but on the other side, there was also internal unrest. So the end of the World War the First resulted in a widespread discontent among the people of Ottoman Empire. The main result of this unrest was that the population of Ottoman Empire faced enormous economic hardship, famine, and also influx of refugees from its lost territories. Therefore, this situation fueled nationalist sentiments and demands for political reform in Anatolia. Okay, so with the end of the World War and with these territorial losses and with this internal unrest and with the Mudros armistice, Ottoman Empire was completely weakened and there was a new movement in Anatolia which demanded a national independence. Okay, so with this new movement, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk emerged as a national leader. So, before this movement, he was a military officer, but he emerged as a key figure in the fight for Turkish independence. He organized resistance against the Allied occupation in Anatolia and he rallied the national forces in Anatolia. Under Atatürk's leadership, the Turkish national movement was founded and it aimed to unite various nationalist groups in Anatolia and to establish a new and independent Turkish state. Okay, so these events were followed by the occupation of Istanbul in March 1920. Okay, so as we said, there was the growing nationalist movement and unrest in Anatolia. And during this unrest, the Allied powers decided to occupy Istanbul in March 1920. As a result of this occupation, the Allied forces disbanded the Ottoman parliament and they tightened their control over the empire. So this occupation of Istanbul galvanized the Turkish nationalist movement. So it demonstrated to the Anatolian population that there was an urgent need for a unified and an independent Turkish state. They needed such an independent state in order to resist foreign control and to safeguard national sovereignty. Okay, so um, with this impulse, there was a division occurred in the Ottoman Empire. So there emerged two rival governments as a result of this challenge. So following the occupation of Istanbul, these two rival governments emerged in or around different political goals or different aims. On the one hand, there was the Sultan's government in Istanbul, and this Sultan's government was under the control of Allied powers. On the other side, in Anatolia, there was the nationalist government. This nationalist government was led by Atatürk. So there was a struggle for power between these two governments. They engaged in this struggle and they tried to undermine each other's authority. Okay, so as you can see, the end of the First War implied a major change for the Ottoman Empire. With its failure as a result of the war, Ottoman Empire encountered certain difficulties and a need for a change. Especially this demand was coming from Anatolia towards an independent and a nationalist state. Okay, so these movements or these events were followed by the Treaty of Sevres. Okay, the Treaty of Sevres was signed on 10th of August 1920 between the Ottoman Empire and the Allied powers. The Sevres Treaty aimed to formalize the partitioning of the empire, and it imposed harsh terms on the defeated Ottoman Empire. What were these terms of the Sevres Treaty? Firstly, the Sevres Treaty required the Ottoman Empire to cede large portions of its territory to the Allied powers. It also required the empire to recognize the independence of Armenia, and it required Ottoman Empire to allow the creation of an autonomous Kurdistan. So what was the reaction to such a treaty? Certainly, these terms were very harsh for the Ottoman Empire to accept, and it further fueled the nationalist sentiment in Turkey. Because this because this treaty imposed unacceptable conditions on the Ottoman Empire, it led to widespread opposition in Anatolia. The nationalist forces or the nationalist movement opposed to these harsh terms of the treaty, and they rejected this treaty ultimately. Okay, so as you can see, the Treaty of Sevres can be described or can be perceived as an unacceptable infringement of Turkish sovereignty. Because if these conditions were accepted, then it would mean the end of the Turkish sovereignty over its own territories. So, what was the response to this treaty? Okay, as we all know from our history classes, the Turkish War of Independence was the reaction to the Treaty of Sevres. So the nationalist movement, as led by Atatürk in Anatolia, launched the Turkish War of Independence after the Sevres Treaty. So this conflict lasted from 1919 until 1922. This conflict aimed, or this war of independence aimed to resist the territorial claims of the Allied powers and to secure Turkish independence. Therefore, as we said before, there emerged two rival governments in Turkey, and on the one hand, the Sultan's government in Istanbul were in cooperation with these allied powers. On the other hand, the nationalist movement in Anatolia rejected the Treaty of Sevres and they started the National War of Independence. Okay, so what was the result of this War of Independence? It was the Treaty of Lausanne. Okay, so as a result of the Turkish War of Independence, the Treaty of Sevres was replaced by the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923. This new treaty recognized the sovereignty of the Republic of Turkey. Okay, so the ultimate result of this war was to uh, make the Allied powers to recognize the sovereignty of this new state. Okay, so Treaty of Lausanne is also important in terms of establishing the modern borders of this new state. It also resulted in undoing of many of the unacceptable conditions imposed by the Treaty of Sevres. Okay, so let's summarize what we have discussed so far and then we will continue. So, first of all, the period following the First World War and the Mudros Armistice was marked by significant political upheaval in Turkish politics. As we explained, um, as a result of the defeat of the Ottoman Empire in the First World War, resulted in significant loss of territory, significant loss of lives, and economic difficulties, um, famine, harsh conditions for the majority of the population in Anatolia, and as a result of the Mudros Armistice, the Allied powers occupied major territories in Anatolia. This resulted in the emergence of a nationalist movement in Anatolia. Okay, the Treaty of Sevres was a political mean to dismantle the Ottoman Empire. Um, so it played a critical role in triggering the nationalist movement in Anatolia. So this nationalist movement rejected the conditions of the Treaty of Sevres and they initiated the Turkish War of Independence. So this War of Independence ultimately led to the establishment of the modern Republic of Turkey. Okay, so the sovereignty of this new state was recognized by Treaty of Lausanne. So the importance of Treaty of Lausanne was that it replaced the Treaty of Sevres and it delineated the modern borders of the new state. Okay, so let's continue to explore the transformative period in Turkish history in the early 20th century. Okay, in the previous lecture last week, we talked about the transformative events in Ottoman Empire's last days. So we mainly focused on the 19th century and we discussed the need for reform and we discussed which measures were taken, which actors were influential in terms of this reform process. Now we will discuss the transformative period during the 20th century. So, in this context, we find three important developments. The first one was the acceptance of the national pact. In Turkish, we know this national pact with the name Misak-ı Milli. The second important event was the establishment of the Grand National Assembly in Ankara. Finally, the third important event was the Constitutional Act of 1921. In Turkish, we know this Constitutional Act under the name of Teşkilat-ı Esasiye Kanunu. Each of these three events played a crucial role in shaping the modern Republic of Turkey, because these three events solidified the sovereignty, independence, and the national unity of the new state. Let's explain the national pact firstly. Okay. National pact is also known under the Turkish name of Misak-ı Milli. These are six principles in its origin. Okay, what are these principles? These principles were formulated by the nationalist movement in response to the Treaty of Service. So, these key principles emphasized the new state's independence, sovereignty, solidarity, and territorial integrity against foreign occupation. So let's summarize these six principles of the Misak-ı Milli. Okay, firstly, the National Pact stated that the future of the Ottoman territories with a majority Turkish population should be determined by the will of the people. The second important principle was that the territorial integrity and political independence of the remaining Ottoman lands should be protected. The third principle was that the security and economic freedom of Istanbul and the Straits should be ensured. The fourth important principle of Misak-ı Milli was that the rights of the Muslim population in the territories detached from the Ottoman Empire should be safeguarded. The fifth principle was that the empire's financial liabilities and capitulations should be revised. This one was important for the economic well-being of the modern state, of the new state. And the final principle was that the establishment of a modern, independent, and unified nation state in Anatolia should be accepted. As you see, the National Pact prepared the foundation of the new state, and the new nationalist state was founded upon this pact. So, what is the significance of National Act for Turkish politics? Because it served as the ideological foundation of the Turkish War of Independence and the modern state. So the National Pact served as the goal for the foundation of the War of Independence, and it also accepted as the foundation of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence of the new nation state. So this is the major significance of the National Pact. Okay, so let's move on to the analysis of the establishment of the Grand National Assembly. Okay, so uh, we said that there was the political turmoil in the Ottoman Empire, and there were two rival governments, one in Istanbul and one in Anatolia. So, under these circumstances, the Grand National Assembly was established on 23rd of April 1920 in Ankara. This assembly was composed of representatives from all regions of Anatolia. This was very important because these representatives came to this assembly in order to represent the will of the Turkish people. So, in the struggle for national independence, the Grand National Assembly signified a very important element of direct democracy, direct representation of the people of Anatolia. So, this National Assembly served as the primary legislative and executive body for the nationalist movement. Therefore, it replaced the Ottoman Empire's parliament, which was previously dissolved by the British invasion of Istanbul. Okay, so you can see that the establishment of the Grand National Assembly played a crucial role in terms of organizing the resistance in Anatolia against the foreign occupation. This Grand National Assembly formulated the national policies and guided this nationalist movement and the people in Anatolia towards their independence. Okay, so we also need to refer to the legitimacy of these two different parliaments. Now you can see that there were two rival governments and two rival assemblies. So what is the legitimacy? Again, the establishment of the Grand National Assembly delegitimized the Sultan's government and the assembly in Istanbul. Because with the foundation or establishment of the Grand National Assembly in Ankara, representing the Turkish people and representing their struggle for self-determination and independence was the major point of legitimacy for this assembly. Okay, let's move on to the third important event or element in terms of the establishment of the modern nation state. This is the Constitutional Act of 1921. In Turkish, we know this act as Teşkilat-ı Esasiye Kanunu. Okay, so the Constitutional Act of 1921 was actually a temporary constitution. It was adopted by the Grand National Assembly on 20th of January 1921. This constitutional act provided a legal framework for the nationalist movement. So, it defined the structure and the functions of the new Turkish state. So, let's try to explain what are these structures and functions of the new modern state. Okay, firstly, the Constitutional Act established a unicameral parliamentary system. So, the Grand National Assembly served as the supreme legislative, executive, and judiciary authority. The Constitutional Act emphasized the principles of national sovereignty, territorial integrity, and also secularism. Okay. What is the significance of the Constitutional Act? We need to understand the important role of the Constitutional Act for Turkish politics. Okay, so the adoption of this act was a critical step in consolidating the power of the national movement. Okay, as we explained, there was a nationalist movement in Anatolia, and they established the Grand National Assembly as the first step towards self authority, self rule, independence. And the Constitutional Act provided another major step towards consolidating the power of this nationalist movement and to establish a modern and independent Turkish state. This act was important because it laid the groundwork for the subsequent Constitution of 1924. Okay, so with this constitutional act, the Turkish Republic could be founded later in 1923, and the subsequent constitution of 1924 could be adopted on this basis. Okay, let's conclude our discussion so far. As a conclusion, all these three important events, the National Pact, establishment of the Grand National Assembly, and the adoption of the Constitutional Act, were all instrumental in shaping the modern Republic of Turkey. During the 20th century, these three events resulted in the assertion of the independence and the sovereignty of this new nation state. So these three events provided the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and national unity against the foreign occupation and against the collapsing Sultan's government in Istanbul. Okay. As we said before, especially the National Pact provided the ideological foundation for the Turkish War of Independence. Therefore, it is considerable because it served as the main trigger of the nationalist movement in Anatolia. Later on, the establishment of the Grand National Assembly delegitimized Sultan's government or assembly in Istanbul. So it became the primary legislative and executive body for the nationalist forces in Anatolia. Finally, the adoption of the Constitutional Act provided the groundwork for the legal and political structures of the emerging new Turkish state. This also established the basis of the following 1924 constitution. Okay, so together these milestones illustrated the determination of the Turkish people during the transformative period in the 20th century. Altogether, these events resulted in the establishment of the new Turkish Republic in 1923. So, these three transformative events were important because they showed the willingness of the nationalist movement in Anatolia to gain their independence, sovereignty, national unity, and to establish a modern democratic state for Turkey. Okay, I think we discussed all important elements that were initiated in the beginning of the 20th century. We discussed their importance, we discussed their role in terms of the establishment of a new modern state, and we also discussed their outcomes. Okay, okay, let's look at the sovereignty principle within these transformative moves. So, as we mentioned, the nationalist movement in Anatolia focused upon the sovereignty principle as the foundation of the new state. Okay, so the sovereignty principle insists that all power and authority belongs to the nation. So, this power and authority could be exercised only by the Grand National Assembly. This sovereignty principle is important and also challenging for the Ottoman Empire because it signifies a complete contrast or a departing point from the absolute monarchy of the Ottoman Empire. So, um, against the absolute monarchy prevalent during the Ottoman Empire, the sovereignty principle established that only the will of people could be the power or authority of this new state. So, as you can see, this is a major ideological change. So the Constitutional Act of 1921 included or founded upon this sovereignty principle, and it changed the mentality or the ideology of this constitutional monarchy towards towards democratic representation. Okay, so in terms of this sovereignty principle, we should certainly refer to the elections and representation in the new modern state. So the Constitutional Act provided that provided that elections for the members of parliament should be held every 2 years. Okay, elections every 2 years provides a regular representation of the people in the National Assembly. As you can see, if you change the members of parliament in the assembly every 2 years. This also provides democratic accountability of the representatives. So the newly emerging Turkish state was founded upon this principle of democratic accountability towards people. With this goal, they established elections every 2 years towards the Grand National Assembly. Okay, um, these three major events did not only bring us to the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and its replacement by the new Turkish state, but also they provided an institutional transformation from the empire into the new modern state. So, with these three major events, we find significant institutional changes in terms of the Ottoman Empire's structure. Firstly, we find the separation of religious institutions from the state institutions. This was the major change from the institutional structure of the Ottoman Empire. Secondly, we find the establishment of an independent judiciary. Thirdly, we find the creation of a council of ministers to exercise executive power. Therefore, these institutional changes were designed to establish a modern state. They also aimed to promote secularism and to create a more efficient and a more accountable system of governance. Okay, so these were important major institutional changes from the Ottoman Empire towards a new, modern, secular, and democratic state. As you can see, there is one more important point, which is a complete regime change. So you can see that all these significant events involved a fundamental change in the political regime. So these changes transformed the country, transformed the state from an absolute monarchy into a modern republic. We can see that this transition was even more strengthened with the proclamation of the Republic of Turkey on 29th of October 1923. So, with the evolution of the Sultanate, we can see the complete transformation from the absolute monarchy into a modern republic. So, in this regime change, now the republicanism was introduced, and this republicanist approach, this republicanist regime, emphasized the national sovereignty, secularism, and democracy. You see, this signifies a complete departure from the Ottoman tradition of rule by a monarch. Okay, so in this lecture, we explain the major transformative events of the 20th century, in the beginning of the 20th century, and in the second session, we will continue our discussion. Okay, thank you very much for your participation, and we will meet again in the second session after a short break.